This is Jim Armstrong. He's a product marketing at Docker, and he's going to be giving a talk called Becoming the Docker Champion, Bringing Docker Back to Work. So please help me in welcoming Jim.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. And thanks everybody for joining us here. I know we're getting close to the end of DockerCon 2017. So just by way of introduction, a little bit of background about me, because you might be a little bit nervous about having a marketing guy standing up here and presenting to you at DockerCon, right? This is going to be another sales pitch, or it's going to be, you know, another, here's what's great about Docker, here's what's great about the MTA program, right? But this is really something that I want to be some practical advice, right? And at the end, I'm going to show you a tool as well that I want and hope that you all will be able to use as you go back and take Docker back to work. My background, just so you know, is I just joined Docker fairly recently, actually. I worked at VMware for 7 years before I joined Docker. So some infrastructure background there. I was an SC and then joined marketing at VMware. And before that, I was at McAfee, so about 10 years in the security industry as well. Again, on the SE side of things, so working with a lot of customers. And so I come from a technical background, but I have joined the dark side here in the last couple of years and now part of the marketing team. So what are we going to cover today? Today is really about, you know, this common theme that we hear from a lot of folks is, I like Docker, I've been playing around with it, I get it, there's a lot of great benefits, but how do I go and build a small team that I can work with, that we can take Docker and start to really bring it to work, right? How do we really start to take something and make it actionable in my environment? And a lot of people are sort of struggling with, overcoming a lot of the objections that they hear. There's a lot of other teams that are involved in this. As you've seen, Docker can affect a lot of people's jobs and how applications work in your environment. So there's a lot of people that can become obstacles to bringing Docker and really operationalizing it. And so that's a lot of what we're going to cover, is that initial sort of, how do I build this team? How do I start to affect some change in my organization with a group of other people that are going to be interested and ready to move forward with Docker? And then ultimately, right, where we want to get is something that can really affect the business as a whole, right? But we're going to focus more on this first piece, is how do we start to build the team and how do we start with Docker at the organization. A lot of this presentation, I've changed this probably a half a dozen times or maybe a full dozen times just in the last couple of days as I listen to customers give their presentations, and as I've talked with a lot of customers and the few months that I've been at Docker, there's some patterns that we've started to see. And so I've tried to synthesize as much as what I've heard and seen from them and into this presentation. So I'll kind of call out where some of these things have come from before, but MetLife was a great example, and their process here, I think, is a good framework for how we should go about discussing this. I think the first thing, obviously, is how do we build a team? How do we go from just me and maybe one or two other people to an actual team that can bring Docker to work, right? That can really start to implement Docker and do something real with it and more than just experiments. How do I then measure what we're going to do? Where are we now, and where do we want to be at the end of this whole thing? What's a big enough change to make people really take notice of what Docker is doing, right? And to really get these people who are initially against Docker to start to wake up and say, okay, I can't ignore this anymore. This is something that I need to look at. It's something that I need to start to think about using myself. So we'll talk about those things as well, and then we'll talk about how you enable some of these people as they become more open to it, as they start to think about this as something that they can use. How can you start to enable them to use Docker more and more? So we'll start with the team aspect of it, right? As you've seen and as we've talked about here, Docker is really something that can affect multiple organizations within a company, right? Now, these are 4 organizations that are just sort of broad categories. Your titles and how you sort of set up your organization are going to be a little bit different in each case, and some of you may fit into multiple categories at your company. Right? But generally speaking, these are the big groups that we see that are involved in Docker. And generally speaking, in the most successful customers, they're all involved in the Docker implementation and the Docker usage on a daily basis. So we'll talk about each one of these teams. I sort of self-identify into one of these categories, what can you kind of do, and what are some of the drivers for the other teams that would help them sort of look at Docker and think of it as something that they can use, something that's interesting to them. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the features and benefits, because I think if you're here at DockerCon, if you're here in this presentation, you've seen a lot of the features and benefits. So I won't spend a lot of time on those, but I'll kind of categorize some of those into benefits that are particular to any one of these individual groups. There's a great quote from another customer who's here giving a presentation this week. I think he's already given it. But his whole philosophy on this as he went about making this change is that acceptance comes when people start to live and feel the benefits. You've got to make it real, right? It's good to have slides, and it's good to sort of have some case studies and things about how other people have done it. That will help get people interested. But until they experience it, until they start to feel it for themselves, right, people are resistant to change. Until they really see that this is a benefit to them and it's not something that's going to take away their job, right, they're going to be resistant to change. So I thought that was a great quote. So as we address these teams, right, I think it's something to keep in mind. You may not be familiar with what all these teams do on a day-to-day basis, right? You may not be familiar with what exactly a developer spends their time doing. You may be a developer and you not be interested in or aware of what the IT ops team does, right? And so that's what I want to kind of address here. Is some of that framework, right? So we talk to other customers and we look at, particularly when Docker is started with, like the IT team, or it started from somebody that's not the application team, right? Frankly, Docker has a reputation as being a developer's tool, so a lot of time it starts with the development team, but not always. If you look at like what MetLife did, the way they got their developers on board, their first application was a WebSphere application. That team had no desire to use Docker. They weren't driving the change for Docker. The operations team was driving it. The way they got the developer team on board, the way they got the application team on board was they built a playground for them, not with that application, but just with WebSphere in general. They just pulled down plain vanilla WebSphere, set up a sandbox for them to go try it and see, hey, okay, I can take WebSphere, it's in a container, but it doesn't change anything that I'm doing, right? I can build the WebSphere application the same way I've been building the WebSphere application. All that's really changed is this new sort of delivery method, how I get my application environment set up and how I take it from, I've created this little hello world application and now I can put it into production. That's changed, but how I build the application didn't really change. And so you'll see a common theme through this, and this is important here as well, is that you may have to put yourself into another team's shoes, right? You may have to learn what that team does, and even though you may not be familiar with it today, and bring it down to their level, right? And really set something up that speaks to them specifically, right? Because they may not really care at the end of the day how a thing runs in operations. How it gets to operations, now that's something that they care about. And what they do on a day-to-day basis when they're developing, that they care about as well. So creating this playground is great. Now, there's other tools for creating a playground as well. If you haven't seen it, there's Play with Docker, which is a great environment, particularly for developers, but for anybody that's learning Docker. If you don't have the ability, the capacity, whatever, to set up your own playground internally, Play with Docker is a great place as well. There's guided, instructions, there's guided labs, but the really great thing about Play with Docker is you can kind of do whatever you want, right? So if it's out there on Docker Hub or Docker Store, you can pull it down into Play with Docker and start going. And for developers, pretty much everything that they do is out there somewhere. So it's a great way for them to start to learn. The other thing is a lot of folks have focused on the teams that are trying to innovate, right? The teams that are really trying to make change. Now, there's two places that innovation comes from. Sometimes it's intrinsic. The application teams themselves want to do something interesting. But even more, I think, the pressure is coming from somewhere else. It's extrinsic to the team. We need to deliver more applications. We need to deliver faster applications. We need our application to be more stable, right? So there's pressure on the team to do something different. But they've got this pattern that they're used to, and it's hard to break out of that pattern sometimes. And so you can use something like Docker as a tool to help bring that change about. So look for those sort of pressure points on these teams. Again, the benefits of Docker, to these teams are somewhat obvious. I think it is easy to learn. It doesn't really change what they do, right? And that's the whole notion of the MTA program. This first step with Docker really shouldn't be about changing everything that anybody does, right? It should be about adapting and fitting into what they do, but then streamlining it, right? So let's not take this WebSphere application and suddenly make it microservices running inside of Docker. Let's put it inside of Docker first, and if you want to make it microservices later, that's phase 2 or 3 or 4 or 27, right? Let's do something a little bit later. The infrastructure team, quite frankly, maybe this is because it's my background as well, and so maybe I'm tuned into this a little bit more, but I tend to see the most personal angst, the most sort of like, my job's at stake with Docker here kind of come up, and I hear this from customers too. If we start to automate everything, and it suddenly becomes so easy to just take an application and for a developer to click a button and suddenly it's in production. The notion is that as an operator, I'm out of a job, right? I don't have anything to do anymore. Or, from a simpler standpoint, hey, I run everything on VMs, and this is going to take away my VMs, and all my tools and all of my operational procedures are built around the concept of a virtual machine, or they're built around the concept of this or that, right? And so again, I think it's about really sort of alleviating these fears that Docker's going to change everything. It doesn't, right? It doesn't have to change all of those things. You can continue to use the tools that you've been using, but Docker is a way to streamline that and to make things faster, to make things simpler. The real fact of the matter is when people start to do this, what we find most of the times is the jobs aren't on the line. Right? We talk about all this time savings, we talk about all the, it takes far fewer man hours to do that, but what actually happens is as people start to move faster and faster, right, it opens up the door to new applications. It opens up the door to new features and new things to be rolled out, which is more work, right? All this automation means is you get to do more and more and more. So the irony of the situation is not that you're doing less, but suddenly you're going to be busier than you ever were before, even though things are automated. And so it really does add to that skill set. The other thing in terms of just, aligning this with goals is, all of these teams and organizations, you guys feel this all the time, right? There's pressures to do something a little bit different. For a while, and I think still now it's how do we get to the cloud? Or now it might be how do we get back out of the cloud? Or how do we get to the third or fourth cloud that we're going to use, right? It's always something with the cloud. Security. Like I said, I worked for McAfee. I started that, part of my career about 20 years ago. And back then, security was the top CIO, in the top 3 CIO objectives. Today, 20 years later, security is one of the top 3 CIO objectives, right? And now there's CISOs and all these other teams built around security is always going to be there. So I think there's a way to get in the door there. And then innovation, again, innovation is sort of a squishy term, but there's some sort of innovation. Every industry we had Finnish Railways on stage this morning. It's a train company, for goodness sakes, right? If a train company is trying to innovate with apps, every industry is innovating with apps, right? Whether you're a restaurant, whether you're a retailer, whatever you might be doing, right? The world is changing and things are moving faster and faster. Again, the features and benefits of Docker, I think, are well worn here. It's a way to simplify. It's a way to standardize across this broad application landscape that people have. It's a way of saying instead of having a set of operational procedures and tools and technologies that work with this set of applications that are running on virtual machines and a different one for this set of applications that are running on bare metal and that one that's on this cloud and that cloud and everybody having separate sorts of things. It's a way of saying, okay, here's the standard operating procedure and we can apply this to all of those and simplify how we do all of this. Security is an interesting one as well. My perspective on this is that security should be involved from day one, right? Security is going to be involved at some point. You don't want security to find out about it after you've started doing this because then they're going to really be against it, right? That's sort of the nature of the security guys that I've worked with before. They want to know ahead of time, and there's a lot of benefits for security guys and gals that come with Docker, right? But Docker is probably, of all the groups that we're talking about here, Docker's probably going to be the most foreign to this team in particular, right? So it's going to be something new to them. It's going to be something that they see as maybe not so proven in the world, something that's still changing, and they're not quite sure how to get their hands around it. So there's a lot that kind of goes into it, but there's a lot of benefits in Docker that do affect the security team too. So I think getting them involved, they really can help, as a matter of fact, sort of drive this change forward. Because if they can see Docker as something that can improve the security of the applications and improve the security of the infrastructure and how things are rolled out, how it's maintained over time, right? That tends to become a driving force for why something is going to happen in the organization. One of the reasons in this whole program, when we start with customers, that we start with a well-known app instead of starting with something brand new, is that it's well understood by all the teams, including the security team. They know what the checklist is for that application. They know what controls have to be put in place for that application. They know what they don't like about that application as well, and the things that they would like to see fixed and improved with that application. So starting with these well-known apps is a great way to get security involved, because they can kind of put it into their own context and start with something instead of something that they're already trying to figure out anyway, right? And now adding this new tool, this new platform on top of that as yet another variable in the equation, right? Security is really trying to, in a lot of cases, take out those variables. And so if you start with something that's well known, you help to take out one of those variables. The last tip here, and again, maybe this is sort of tying back into my own personal history, is that I tend to pay attention to some of these things. There are a lot of container security startups that are out there as well. Now, this can be a good thing or a bad thing. So if you're in the side of the camp where security is saying, well, Docker's way too new, right? Then you probably don't want to start bringing in security startups as a way to sort of convince them, because they're going to be against that as well. However, a lot of security teams are looking for ways to add new layers of defense, right, into the system. So they've got their traditional sort of border security and network security and scanners for all these different sorts of things, right? Within Docker, obviously, we can point out some of the security benefits, but these security startups can help to show that there's some new layers of security that can be brought into the application itself, right, because of the nature of putting it into containers and the way that the networks work within containers. Within a containerized system as well. So it's an opportunity to actually introduce some new things to the security team that could help take this forward as well. So again, in terms of the actual Docker benefits, you've seen things like the security scanning, right? So we can look and see exactly what's in an image. You've seen the content trust, so you can sign it. A lot of organizations don't do their own development. They get applications from somebody else. The development is outsourced to another team. It's a way to digitally verify that it's coming from that organization and you know exactly what's in it. It hasn't been messed with by the time it gets to your organization, and put that through the entire supply chain, right? It's a way of controlling who has access to what, all through that supply chain. Who can develop what, who can put it into production, who can do anything in between, all of those different phases. And so there's a lot of things that are within the Docker product itself that really can help, open security's eyes and help convince them to go on this journey with you. And the final group is management. Obviously, this one's fairly obvious. If you're going to take this anywhere, if it's going to become more than just a science experiment, you're going to have leadership on board, right? You may be the leader of this particular sort of change team, but to really drive this forward and to make it something that becomes bigger than just one application or bigger than just one small group of dedicated change agents, you need some management on board to take it forward. And they're always looking at how is this going to change the business? How do we make things better? What potentially could become worse if we do this? And of course, things like how much is this really going to cost us if we're going to bring this in and implement it. There's a great quote from Jeff from MetLife in his presentation. This was in his breakout presentation yesterday. If you didn't get to see it, he's the manager, right? So he's the leader of this team. He's in IT management. And his quote, when they got this whole thing started, was, look, I need a better business plan than cute stickers on a laptop and hoodies that my hippie developers are wearing. That's not a business plan, right? I need real numbers. I need facts. I need data that's going to show me what this is actually doing for the organization, because I have to go and then convince my bosses, right, that this is something that they should be doing across the organization as well. A lot of times what we can show is, from a financial impact, that there's savings and advantages from that first project, right? When we do this whole MTA program, we measure everything. Before we get there, we measure things afterwards, because we want to give you that kit, that thing. We call it the Champions kit, but that thing that you can take back to your organization and say, here's what we did, here's what, from a practical implementation standpoint, here's how things work, and then here are the real hard numbers, the facts about what changed from beginning to end. And so there's a lot of measurement. There's a lot of work, quite frankly, just pen to paper, measuring things. How long does it take to do things? Conceptually, we know this process is broken, this group takes too long, this application is frail, but you got to measure. You got to put down numbers. Why is it frail? What's broken here? What can we change, or what do we hope to change if we bring anything in besides Docker, right? Forget about Docker, but what are we going to bring in that's going to affect a change here, right? So we have lots of tools and things that we can show and help, to get these management folks on board. You've seen stats from all these customers, right? Every customer, I think, that's been up on the keynote stage, most of the customers that have done breakout sessions have shown their own stats in terms of infrastructure consolidation or in terms of developer productivity and all that. So we have lots of information around that that can help. We also have a way for you to start to forecast your own results, right? So we have an ROI calculator that you can use. Every company has an ROI calculator, right? It's a requirement. And this is actually, my baby. So if you have a problem with the ROI calculator, I'm open to feedback on it. But it's available for you to use. Go and, as you start to think about what might be your first application or 2 applications or 3 applications that you want to use with Docker, and you start to measure what's broke with some of those things and where you are today, you can plug those numbers into the ROI calculator and start to get a result, start to forecast what those returns might be, not just in terms of dollar savings, which is important, but in terms of things like developer productivity and operations productivity as well. You see this all the time, right? Docker's is an engine for innovation, but innovation, as I said before, is kind of the squishy term. It can mean a lot of things, right? So look, we talk about modernizing traditional applications, and people sometimes immediately think, hey, we're going to go microservices. Hey, we're going to go and do things faster and better releases. And again, as I said, that might be what you want, right? That might be innovation for your company. And that's fantastic. You can get there, right? It may not be step 1, but you can get there eventually. But for some companies, innovation means I need to consolidate my data center. I need to come up with a better way of maintaining my applications. And that's it, right? I'm not going to the cloud. We're never going to the cloud, right? And so it can be simple as well. All of these things can be innovative to a company. So it's important to sort of define that for your company, to know what it means, particularly for your management to be innovative and what's the next change that they're looking to make in the organization. And the last thought on people, this one was from the PayPal presentation. So if you didn't see that one, I encourage you to go and look at the presentation. This is a summary. This is not the whole. He actually showed far more in the presentation than what I'm going to. This is just sort of a summary of what I kind of gleaned from it. But just a last thought on this thing. Right? As you go and do this, expect pushback. People are going to be against this at first because it's new. It's a change, right? And it's a change that can affect multiple organizations. And because of that, it can be difficult. Some tools you bring in, it just affects your team. It just affects one particular silo, one particular application. And that becomes much easier because you don't have to convince a lot of people to do it. But something like this can affect an entire organization. So you're going to face pushback along the way, right? In a lot of cases, you're going to run into obstacles where you're essentially already wrong. Before they've seen anything else, they already know that you're wrong and you've made a mistake, right? And they're going to be critical. Every time you do something, this is new, right? And you may still be learning Docker as well. And something may not work the way you think it works. And when those people see it, they're going to push back even harder, right? So you need patience for this. You need to be, as I said before, you have to step into their shoes and take on their role and then address those issues head on, right? And help them fix what they think is broken, right? You have to work on the full stack. Now, the PayPal presentation, I think this was kind of focused on the full stack of the application, but I think you have to work on the full stack of the people as well. So again, it's about adapting to what other teams need from this because you really need them on your side to go forward with Docker. It's about, in the developer example, I don't know WebSphere, but I can go and create a playground for somebody that knows WebSphere to start using it, right? If I didn't know anything about security, I could still say, well, I know that these security features are cool. I know what our security checklist looks like for a new application that somebody wants to roll out. How do I align what those features are with what our security checklist is internally so that I can go to the security team and say, okay, what if we could automate this checklist a little bit more, right? And show it to them that way. So you kind of have to work from a different perspective there. And then finally, and this is maybe the most critical, is the willingness to sort of spread this knowledge around. Right? It's great that you know it, and it's great that you're the change agent and you build this team of innovation within your organization. But you have to let the teams, these other folks that are going to be using it, start to spread their own wings, right, and run on their own. And you need to sort of enable them to be able to do that, to run at a different speed than you might be running at as well, right, and to go down their own path with a view overall that we're going to create a common platform and a common way of delivering applications. But let them experiment on their own. Let them start to learn and do things their way. Okay, so you've started to build this team, right? You started to get people on your side, and you're ready to look at, okay, how do we start to actually implement this, right? How do we bring this and make it more practical? And as I said before, I think measure is one of the first things that you have to do, right? And a lot of people look at things like deployment times, and they look at how long does it take us to get a new feature into production, and how long does it take to develop a feature, and all those kinds of things. Those are critically important. I'm not saying that they're not, but there are things that I think people miss as well. How long does it take you to roll back something when it's broken? Can you roll back something when it's broken? Because things break, right? If you need to put in a critical fix, how long does it take to get that there, get that rolled out? What is your failure rate on deployments, right? How much time does somebody spend just sitting in front of a computer screen, not doing anything, but just watching the monitors to make sure nothing breaks, right? That's just wasted time. That somebody should be doing something else, right? All of these things go into the things that we need to measure, right? And importantly, on top of that, we have to look at where we want to go, right? What's the goal for this? And again, this needs to be set in your own terms. If you're measuring things in weeks and days and months for your deployments, which is very common, then you have a case for Docker, right? You have a case for Docker, and it's obvious. But where do you want to go with this? A lot of customers who started using Docker and are successful with it get to the point where things become near instant, right? That may not be where you want to get in phase one. You may want to get down to minutes, or a day might be great for you, or a week might be great for you. For a lot of companies, 1 week to roll out a feature change would be phenomenal, right? But you need to measure that, and you need to be able to set goals so that you can see where you're going to get to, and then measure, once you've started this, did I get there? Or did I exceed it? Or what didn't work, right? But you have to have these things written down ahead of time. And then don't forget to do the root cause analysis. Okay, this thing's broken, that's obvious. It takes a month. Why does it take a month, right? What's the root cause situation behind it? And you have to be honest about this, right? Particularly within this change team, you have to be honest about it. There are three sort of categories where things can go wrong, right? People, process, and technology. If it's the process or if it's the technology, that might be a little bit easier to sort of point out because it's not a personal thing, right? And people sort of expect that over time, the processes are going to change and technology is going to change. So they're a little bit more open to seeing suggestions there. But when it comes to a personal change, like this group is broken, they're dysfunctional, that becomes a bigger problem, right? But you have to be honest about that and know that that's something you're going to face going forward. The other thing too is we talk about the assessment and setting these goals. Let me talk about the scope of this. This MTA project, the MTA POC that you've heard a ton about this week, and hopefully you've heard about before. Again, I relate this back to sort of my own background, and I think about the first time I created a VM. For me personally, I had a laptop that was dying. I got a new laptop, and I needed to get files off of it. Right? It was a simple use case. I didn't want to back up the files. I didn't want to go through and start searching through files and marking which ones I need is a pain, right? I just created a VM. I used VM Converter to do it. And I sat there and 6, 7, 8 hours later, I forget exactly how long it took, I had a VM, right? I had my whole machine there. Did I do anything magical to that machine? Well, kind of. I put it into this little container called a VM. But other than that, the machine didn't change. It was still Windows. It was still the same applications. It was still the same everything, right? But the cool thing about it was I now had it. I could boot it up anytime. I could still boot it up today. It's still sitting on a DVD at home, and I can still run it on my Mac today. And that was really cool, right? And that's how this whole thing started with VMs, is it became this thing, now it's portable. I can now take it somewhere else. And that was all it really didn't make it suddenly go from Windows NT to Windows 2016 magically. That doesn't happen because you put things in a VM, right? And it's the same thing when we start with Docker. It's the reason why when we look at the MTA program, our goal isn't to get you microservices on, in that first week. Our goal is to get things into a container and to keep operating the way that you're operating, but to simplify, how you deliver that container, that application into the environment. And then the last thing here, as we start to wrap up, is this whole thing about how do we go, about this and actually enabling people and enabling ourselves to take this forward, right? So beyond this presentation and the little chat we've had here today, I hope that's been helpful, and you'll obviously have the slides and things, and you can of course go back and and watch other customers' presentations from this week and all that kind of stuff. But I wanted to give you something practical out of this as well that you can actually take back and use. So I've created this thing that right now I'm calling a guide to becoming the Docker champion. The title may change. Lots of things may change as we continue to build this. But it's a little booklet that you can change, that you can use, right? And it's got these things written down in it. So it'll have things like the metrics, the things that you need to measure, right? Where are we today? How do we measure these things? What's the sort of scope of the measurement? Is it in weeks and months, right? And then where do I want to get? What's my goal for this project if I start to use Docker? So we look at things like deployment metrics and time to repair things and feature additions and all those kinds of things from a metric standpoint. So you can use that to start to measure yourself and start to figure out where you want to go. As you work at building this team and you work at sort of expanding the scope of who's using Docker and getting other people on board, this will also give you some practical things like obviously again sort of in your mind the features and benefits of Docker. But if you want to go back and show other people, you might need some tools to do that as well. So we'll build that into here too. And then the customer stories. So if you want to take it back to your team and say, look, here's what XYZ company did. They look like us. They're running the same applications as us. Or, here's what a developer team did. Or here's what an operations team did with Docker. That'll be in this guide as well. Hopefully, next year when we come to DockerCon, you guys will be up on stage and you'll be giving presentations. We'll have your story in the Champions Kit as well if you want to have it in the Champions Kit. So that's one thing, right? So that'll be made available to you, and I'll provide the link for that. The big thing here that I'm asking for, and I've never done this before with an asset that I've created, but this is something new that I want to try, is I want you to contribute to this as well, right? So I'll do the work, right? I'll keep it up to date, and I'll put stuff in it, and I'll have all of our standard things in there. But you're going to go through it, and you're going to look at the metrics, and you're going to say, well, you forgot something. Hey, you need to add this in here. Right? So I want you to contribute. I want your voice to be a part of this because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what a marketing guy says, right? What matters to you is the numbers that are important to you. So I want you to contribute. Now, GitHub is a little bit of a weird place to sort of contribute on PowerPoint, but it's what we're going to use because it's available to everybody. It's freely open, right? So you can use the issues there. You can use pull requests if you want with the PowerPoint. It's fine. I'll do the manual work of then pulling it down and merging it, but nonetheless, if you're not a GitHub user, you can still go out there, you can still grab the PowerPoint, you can email me and just say, hey, add this, or this team is resistant and I can't figure out how to sort of overcome this objection. Can you help me? We're more than willing and more than happy to help with that. The final thing is, don't go it alone. As you build this team, we talked about the 4 groups within your organization that will help, but key to that as well is the people outside your organization that are here to help too. Right? And that includes Docker and includes our partners. And that's where we get into this MTA program. That's why this whole thing exists, is so that we can come and be part of that change team with you. Right? These are examples from the Champions Kit. So this is what you get after an MTA, right? We'll take those numbers that we have in that guide that I built, we'll then take that and transfer it over to the Champions Kit. So this becomes your presentation. This becomes your document that you take to other teams and you take to other leaders within your organization to show them what you've done, right? To show them proof of how this worked for you. And the thing about Docker, and this is what one of the things of many things that I love about working at Docker, what we celebrate internally is the customer usage of Docker, right? Like I said, I've worked on the sales side at several other companies before, and not to say anything bad about either one of those companies in general. We all have worked with IT vendors who seem to exist to sell us something, right? To get us a license, and then that's it. We'll see them in a few months. What I think is really cool about Docker is what we really get excited about is customers actually implementing it, hearing their stories. And beyond that, not just the first implementation. Great, they got 5 nodes of Docker set up. That's great. It's fantastic to see new customers. But it's great to see customers start to expand and to learn more about what they're doing with Docker and to see Docker change as customers start to use it more and more as well. So don't go it alone. Get us involved, get our partners involved early, because I think Docker really can be, obviously something that can make a massive change to an organization across, a broad set of teams. And we want to help make that happen for you. All right. That's it. I'm happy to take questions. I think we've got a roaming mic. There's mics set up here as well. You need to use a mic so we can get you on tape. But I'm happy to take questions as well. I'm also happy not to take questions if you would prefer. All right. Well, again, come seek me out. Email me. Download this Champions guide. Start using it. Send me feedback. I do want to hear from you, and I do want to hear your stories, so we can continue to make this better for everybody. All right. Thanks again.